Welcome to Math Science History. I'm Gabrielle Burchak, your host. I'm a science communicator with a background in math, science, and journalism. In the 1950s, there was a young woman who sat at a desk in the computing department at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory by day and wrote science fiction by night. Her name was Mari Graham. Her pen name was Mari Wolf. Many years ago, while I was in college, I had the incredible opportunity to work at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL. It was an honor to step foot on that vast laboratory, and honestly, it felt like heaven. At NASA, I worked in media relations where I had the honor of meeting so many fantastic individuals who told me countless stories about JPL from the early days. It was a land of discovery, and honestly, it still is. And it was such a treat to do research there, and I loved spending time in the library at JPL, going through the old newsletters called Lab Oratory. It was there that I came across a small article, a very small article, about a subculture sci-fi author who worked in computing. This tiny little article was called Interesting Hobbies at JPL. And I held onto that article for over 20 years, which, coincidentally, found its way to my desk when I was getting ready to write an article about women at JPL. Southern California in the 1950s was like a place where the future slips out from behind the mountains. The roads were long and scattered with houses and buildings. The desert sat just beyond the edges of the city like a blank page. And in the air, there was a particular kind of confidence, sometimes earned, sometimes borrowed, the sense that anything could be built if you were willing to calculate, test, and try again. And no doubt, when you drive up to JPL, even today, you still get goosebumps and you still feel that sense of unencumbered scientific exploration. In the 1950s, in that world, there was a young woman who sat at a desk in the computing department. Her name was Mari Graham. And when the workday ended, when the last figures were checked and the paper stacks were squared, she returned to another kind of work. This kind asked for imagination, nerve, and the willingness to be misunderstood. She wrote science fiction under the name Mari Wolf. Her full name was Marianita Beatrice Wolf. And if you only encountered Mari Wolf in a list of short stories, she might look like a brief spark. Her work appeared in a handful of publications over a few years, and then the record quieted. But that quiet did not mean she had been small. It meant that she had been easy to file away, because women like Mari often were. They were described as assistants to history, not its authors. They were treated as also and in addition to. They were typed into the margins of someone else's story, even when they had been writing their own, line by line, page by page, refusing to apologize for wanting more than one life. And it's interesting how it juxtaposes her day job, which was working as a calculator at NASA. Mari's story belonged to Los Angeles, to the desert, to fandom, and to the culture of rockets and magazines and late-night conversations that turned into movements. It belonged to the early space age, before the world decided what to celebrate and what to forget. Mari was born on August 27th, 1926 in California, where the weather was always perfect and there were orange trees in everyone's yard. However, that was not Mari's life growing up. In the March 1952 edition of Imagination magazine, she writes that when she was 6 weeks old, her parents took her to Portobello, Ecuador. It was not ideal growing up there. She writes that her family went down to Guayaquil on a fruit boat. The boat was not equipped for babies, and when her mother had to wash and dry her cloth diapers, the crewmen would fly them from the captain's bridge. Eventually, after taking a fruit boat, a river boat, a flat car on a single-gauge freight railroad, and a string of mules, they arrived. She lived there until she was 3 years old when her parents, as she states, reversed the mule railroad riverboat freighter process and came back to the States to settle in Laguna Beach, California. Growing up, her parents read her the Greek and Roman myths, which fostered her love for mythological stories. She had fallen in love with fiction literature. Her favorite stories included Atlas the Earth Holder and Sinus the Moon Holder. All of this encouraged her throughout her life to write science fiction. And throughout high school, she was often bored. Who wasn't? So in classes, she read science fiction. In high school, her ambitions included riding horses and diving off rocks into the ocean. During this time, she considered a variety of occupations, including dancing, horse riding, stunt work for film and television, and mathematics. She eventually zeroed in on a passion and attended UCLA, where she majored in mathematics. After college, she did some modeling and taught dance, and through it all, she kept reading science fiction. Then she immersed herself in the world of Los Angeles science fiction fandom. From there, she joined the Outlander Society, an adjacent science fiction fan club for people living in the outlands of Los Angeles. And I can tell you this truthfully, living in Los Angeles, we don't have outlands anymore. So though the first few years of her life were in Ecuador, she was an LA local. She belonged to Southern California in an intimate way, the way you belong when you knew the quality of the light, the smell of warm asphalt, and the feel of desert air that cooled fast after sunset. She would travel to various destinations and attend science fiction fan club events. Then, in September of 1951, she went to a sci-fi convention called NorwestCon in Oregon, where she attended the Raj Phillips Clubhouse in Amazing Stories. It was there, on September 1st, 1951, that she met Roger Phillips. Within 6 weeks, she and Roger were married. After 6 weeks. In her autobiography in Imagination magazine, she notes that she and Roger lived happily ever after. Mari's work spoke for itself, and Mari's world made it possible because LA was not only a city of studios and citrus, it was a city of clubs and meeting rooms where people gathered to argue about the future. One of those places was the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society, known as LASFS. It was a science fiction and fantasy fan society founded in 1934 that met week after week, year after year. And it became the kind of institution that lasted, the kind of place where stories were not a guilty pleasure, but a shared language. It became known as the oldest, continuously operating science fiction club in the world. And it was a weekly Thursday gathering that kept going when other things fell apart. Imagine that room, not as a museum piece, but as a living space. A few chairs, a table that had seen too many elbows, people arriving with magazines under their arms or notes in their pockets, people who wanted to be near others who cared about the same strange, bright things. People who wanted to talk about the future as if it were something you could hold in your hands. Mari was part of that world. She was part of early science fiction fandom in Los Angeles, a member of LASFS in the era when fandom still felt handmade. When the lines between reader, fan, writer, and editor blurred into a single social ecosystem. And she did more than just attend. She wrote a monthly column in Imagination magazine, reviewing amateur science fiction. That column was called Pandora's Box. So Imagination was first published in October 1950 and was owned by Clark Publishing Company. However, shortly thereafter, the magazine was sold to Greenleaf Publishing Company, which was owned by William Hamling. Hamling became the magazine's lifetime editor. The magazine heralded prominent contributors, including the legendary Ray Bradbury, Philip K. Dick, Robert Sheckley, and Powell Anderson. Among those great names Mari was also one of them. Pandora's Box was a fandom column, a running thread through the community, a place where clubs and conventions and fanzines could be acknowledged, and where the culture could recognize itself. The magazine ran for years. For Mari, it was a form of labor, a form of community building, and what she loved most, writing. As a mathematician and an employee of JPL, Mari lived at the intersection of two essential and prominent worlds, the technical world of computing and the cultural world of science fiction, and she treated both like they mattered because they did. When I imagine Mari in Los Angeles at this time, I imagine her moving through a city that held multiple realities at once. A city where a science fiction club could become a weekly ritual for decades. A city where people could gather on a Thursday night and talk about impossible worlds like they were planning a trip. LA was a city where magazines mattered, where the line between amateur and professional was not a wall, but rather a ladder you could climb. LA was not only a place where science fiction was published, it was a place where imagination was staged, built, and made visible. Hollywood had become an industry of illusion, but the illusion could feel like a preview of tomorrow. When you stepped onto a set, you could walk by a spaceship and also through the interior corridors of that spaceship, the control panels and the lights meant to mimic distant stars. You could stand beneath a towering robot built to loom over a crowd, and then there were the theatrical computers designed to look as though they could govern the people around it. You could pass an ominous lab with glassware and strange slime arranged to suggest that discovery might spill into danger. Props included heat rays, ray guns, and small alien ships like manta rays with articulated cobra-like heat ray projectors from the War of the Worlds. Then you could walk into a commissary and see an actor in alien makeup eating a sandwich between takes, as if the extraordinary belonged to the everyday. This city made the border between science and fiction feel thin, and that feeling could change what people believed was possible. LA offered Mari a living reminder that the future could be imagined, constructed, and revised. Between her work at JPL and her sci-fi clubs, she carried that energy back to her desk at home, and she kept writing. We'll be right back after a quick word from my advertisers. Mari did not only write stories, she wrote community. Her monthly column, Pandora's Box, reviewed amateur science fiction. For people who lived for this world, for people whose friendships were built in letters and mimeographed pages, that column mattered. It reminded fans that they existed, it connected names, and it made a network feel like a place. And when Mari left that column after her divorce, the column did not disappear. Her voice in the column disappeared, but Pandora's Box remained and science fiction kept growing. But no doubt, her world shifted significantly. Mari Wolf was not a hobbyist in the way that the word got used to diminish women. She was an author. She published in major magazines, maintained a monthly column, and built a presence in a cultural scene that took writing seriously, even when the wider world dismissed it as pulp. Women have always had careers that were treated like hobbies by people who did not want to imagine women as professionals. Women have always had side work treated like a charming accessory rather than the main energy of life. And this month being Women's History Month, the truth is, for many women, it takes tooth and nail effort to make any creative career work. It demands resilience, self-promotion, persistence, and the ability to keep going even when your work is described as less than it is. Mari didn't just embody the mathematics at JPL, she exemplified the life of an author. Authorship was entrepreneurship before anybody wanted to call it that, and Mari did that. She wrote and published in a market that could be harsh, competitive, and quick to forget you. But Mari held her place anyway, doing so with courage and brilliance. As a quick side note, Pandora's Box was carried on by Robert Bloch, who went on to become an award-winning author and penned the book Psycho. Bloch was a protege of H.P. Lovecraft. And since I'm mentioning H.P. Lovecraft, I want to give a quick shout out to my lifelong friends that I've known since high school, Sean Branney and Andrew Lehman, who are the owners of the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society out here in Glendale, California. If you are a sci-fi fan and you love the Lovecraftian world, go visit the society. It is a delectable display of novelties and curiosities. Mari Wolf's science fiction appeared primarily in the magazine If, Worlds of Science Fiction in the early 1950s, with her additional stories published in other venues. And if you are a sci-fi buff, heads up. If Worlds of Science Fiction has relaunched in 2023, and you can buy the magazine anthologies on Amazon. You can visit worldsofifmagazine.com, all one word, worldsofifmagazine.com. But back to Mari, her published short fiction included Robots of the World Arise, An Empty Bottle, The House on the Vacant Lot, Prejudice, The Statue, Homo Inferior, The First Day of Spring, and The Very Secret Agent. It was not a huge list, but it was not a casual list either. It was a body of work with distinct temperament. With that said, let's walk through the house of Mari Wolf. When we open the front door, there is a strange kind of historical echo of the word droid. That is because her story, Robots of the World Arise, has been credited with an early use of the word droid in this story. This was decades before it became lodged in pop culture like a permanent fixture. Mari wrote about robots and labor in a way that did not flatter human beings. In her world, the robot was not simply a gadget. The robot was a mirror, a worker, and a vessel for the questions nobody wanted to ask out loud. What did people do when they decided something else existed to serve them? And what did they do when they could replace a person with a machine or treat a person like a machine? She wrote it with the kind of clarity that felt dangerous, the kind of intelligibility that suggested she had watched systems work from the inside, because she did. She knew that robots and computers were not the systems of fantasy. They were the systems of real life. It was real for her. Now, traveling to the next room, you will note that there is nothing but an empty bottle in the middle of the room. This is also the name of her story, An Empty Bottle, which feels almost quieter, almost domestic, and almost harmless. But Mari's quietness often carried a blade. Her story, An Empty Bottle, suggested loss, waste, and the residue of something used up. It meant an object that once contained something valuable and now held only the shape of what had been. In the early 1950s, the world was full of empty bottles, empty promises, and empty assurances. It was a world that looked stable until you held it up to the light. Mari's writing did not always shout. Instead, it often lingered, letting the implications accumulate. Stepping into this next room, observe a statue. Something fitting about the title, The Statue, is that history itself often treated people like statues. It froze them in one pose, one image, one caption, and then walked away. Mari's The Statue plays with that idea, with permanence and erosion, and with what remains when life is stripped of motion. She knew that the space age had its own statues, but they weren't only in stone. She knew that the future would hold myths and archetypes. Now we enter an enclosed sun porch. In the corner is a young boy about 10 years old, sitting with a bouncy ball, talking to it while kids outside play. This story, Homo Inferior, does not ask politely. Homo Inferior carries the sound of classification, the cold language of hierarchy, the kind of phrase that could be stamped onto a file folder, whispered into a policy, or used to justify cruelty without admitting it was cruelty. Science fiction in that era often played with the idea of the other, which were alien worlds, strange species, and evolutionary leaps. It was a parallel to what was going on in society at that time as well. Mari's story, even in its title, pointed back at the most familiar danger of all, which wasn't aliens. In Homo Inferior, the greatest threat was those among us and the ways leaders created categories and then acted as though those categories were natural law. In this story, the greatest danger lie in how many people decided who mattered. Now let's step into the kitchen. It is a nostalgic kitchen from the 50s. There is a mint green table with matching chairs in the middle. Everything is mint green, including the cabinetry. Everything is mint green except for the black apron draped across the back of the chair. The kitchen door slams closed, and that is precisely what Mari's story titled Prejudice depicts. You don't have to decode the story. Her story, Prejudice, was not dressed up in metaphor. Prejudice was the thing itself. It was the engine behind countless historical disasters, and it was also a quiet daily poison. And this sounds all too familiar. Mari wrote in a period when the United States was busy congratulating itself on freedom while policing who deserved it. She wrote during a period when women and people of color and other nationalities were expected to fit into a narrow set of acceptable shapes, and stepping outside those shapes came with a cost. And Mari did not hide from the ugliness of that. The air in this kitchen is a bit ominous, so let's step outside for a bit. In this story, the first day of spring means thaw. It means breath. It means the possibility that something could begin again. But Mari's spring did not have to be naive. It could still carry the memory of winter. It could still hold the knowledge that beauty did not erase the past. The first day of spring is a love story, and I really like the idea that Mari wrote a sci-fi story across this range, from cold classification to the fragile possibility of renewal. It made her feel less like a type of writer and more like a person who had moods, seasons, and curiosity. The first day of spring shows the heart of a woman who lived in the real world and wrote towards something better, even when she did not fully believe it would come to pass. So before we leave Mari's house and property, let's go sit in the car where we can't be heard. I'm going to talk about her story, The Very Secret Agent, and then the secrecy that she knew. Mari's era was soaked in secrecy. It was the early Cold War, the age of codes and clearances and quiet careers that could not be fully explained to the wrong person at a dinner party. To be a secret agent in science fiction was not only to be part of a fantasy, it was to reflect an atmosphere that ordinary people could feel in their bones. The sense that some forces were moving behind the scenes and that your life might be shaped by decisions made in rooms you never entered. Mari wrote in those spaces. Her stories knew what it felt like and foresaw how future generations would register their world. We'll be right back after a quick word from my advertisers. With that said, being exposed to the new world of computing at JPL, she brought a fresh perspective to science fiction. It was unique and vibrant. In the middle of the 20th century, computing did not mean what it means now. It did not always mean glowing screens, sleek devices, and silent processing. It often meant people. It meant rooms where the work arrived in piles, where precision mattered, where the job was to make numbers behave, to turn the messy physical world into something that could be handled, predicted, and measured. Mari worked in that environment. This new NASA laboratory was building its identity in those years, and the work demanded focus. If you loved math, if you trusted procedure, if you found satisfaction in getting it right, there was a place for you at JPL. And there is a particular kind of courage that shows up when people build things without permission. Not reckless courage and not the kind that ignores consequences. The kind that looks at a new idea and thinks, We will try it. And that is what Mari did. She tried and eventually accomplished her goal of becoming an author. In Mari's Los Angeles, that courage also drove an amateur rocketry scene. It was a group of enthusiasts called the Pacific Rocket Society, or PRS. This group conducted unclassified missile firings in the Mojave Desert. They were not hidden in a bunker. Instead, they were out in the open, in a landscape that made room for audacity. In the official photographs from that era, people stood with the sun in their eyes and the desert behind them. They looked as though they were trying to catch up to their own imaginations. And Mari was active in PRS. She attended events and meetings alongside doctors, housewives, secretaries, mechanics, engineers, and merchants. Also in attendance at PRS were many JPL employees. And because PRS drew attention, Mari did too. She received international publicity in connection with PRS activities, and she appeared in magazines such as Look, which was a human interest magazine, and Popular Mechanics, the legendary magazine for engineers. These appearances matter because they place her in a public-facing story of the space age and hint that she was not simply orbiting a technical world. Mari Wolf was visible. She was present. And I find myself thinking about how that must have felt to stand in the world of rockets and tests and desert winds while also carrying a private world of stories in your head. In our current era, with so many advancements, we know what it's like to write fiction as the future we imagine begins to materialize in real life. But in the mid-20th century, it was new, exciting, and breathtaking. There is a temptation when we talk about that era to treat it like a tidy myth. A handful of famous men, a few iconic launches, and then the history rushes forward. But the truth was broader and stranger. The space age was built by people who were rarely photographed with their names in the captions. It was built by women in technical roles, described by job titles that sounded small, as if language itself were trying to contain them. It was built by communities, by clubs, by amateurs and professionals mixing in the same circles, trading ideas, exchanging drafts, and developing collaborations that made accomplishments seem surmountable. And in the midst of it, Mari wrote. She did not write about rockets as shiny toys, but about systems and power. She wrote about who gets reduced to a tool and about what happens when a society decides it can classify people and dispose of them. As I noted earlier, Mari wrote that she and Roger lived happily ever after. However, that was not the case. It was a rocky marriage that ended in divorce. Still, around the same time that she and Roger moved to Hollywood, she landed that position at JPL in the computing division and at night wrote her books. Not as a pastime, not as a little side diversion to decorate her real work. Mari wrote as an author. I always pause on that word, author. In a paper titled The Transformation of Gender in English Language Fiction, published in the Journal of Cultural Analytics, the authors note that there was a stunning decline in authorship in the mid-20th century. They write that the proportion of fiction actually written by women dropped by half in the 1950s. Women were being told to step away from their World War II jobs, get married, have kids, put on an apron, and be grateful that they get to stay home and clean the house. Women should be so grateful that before their husband gets home, they should make him dinner, refresh their makeup, make their male husband a drink, and have his slippers at the ready. And Mari was having none of that. In the 1950s, when women wrote, it was regularly described as a hobby, something they did in addition to, as if art, imagination, and ambition were only legitimate when they were secondary. At JPL, an internal publication called Lab Oratory was published in 1954, and in that issue, Mari was photographed at her typewriter, posed for a showcase. In the image, she looked like someone caught midlife, mid-thought. She was not turned into a symbol. She was simply there. This article that I saved from the JPL archives was titled Interesting Hobbies at JPL, and the title was a juxtaposition to the article, which described her as a successful science fiction writer. The title positions the writing alongside the job, as if it were a charming extra, rather than a second profession that requires the same stamina and discipline as any other career. But the article recognized her achievements in the sci-fi realm. Mari's known bibliography of short fiction clustered between 1952 and 1954. Later, in 1961, she published a mystery novel called The Golden Frame. Her life continued beyond the years most people remembered her for. However, history often treats women like Mari as if they blinked in and out of existence, as if they appeared briefly, made a contribution, and then vanished. In reality, Mari was still there. She was still living, still working, still changing. The record briefly vanished until the internet became a reality. Her works are available on Project Gutenberg, and I will post a link to them on mathsciencehistory.com. And as a quick note, while you're there at mathsciencehistory.com, be sure to click on that coffee icon and make a donation to the podcast, because every penny that you donate, every penny, even if it's $1, it goes toward keeping the podcast up and running. But this is why Mari's work matters so much now. Her stories remain, and we can still read them. You can still hear her voice through the page, direct and unsentimental, sometimes tender, often sharp. It remains because even when institutions treated her writing as an in addition to, her writing treated itself as essential. Mari wrote about power, classification, labor, and the cost of progress. She wrote at the Piedmont of the Colossus space age, and she made sure her stories carried the shadow of what she saw. And in the end, that was what I could not stop thinking about. Mari was a mathematician who worked in computing in a world obsessed with the future. Then she went home and wrote the future in her own language, not as a footnote, not as a hobby, but as an author. The space age did not only belong to people whose names end up on plaques. It belonged to the people who ran the numbers and kept the work moving, the people who showed up week after week, the people who built communities of thought, the people who sparked imagination, and the people who wrote stories that shaped what the future even felt like. Mari Wolf was one of those people. She lived in Los Angeles. She belonged to its science fiction community. She took part in rocket society culture, and she wrote fiction that still reads like a warning flare. Mari Graham deserves to be remembered as more than an also. She deserves to be remembered as Mari Wolf, the science fiction author. Thank you for listening to Math Science History. If you want the next episode as soon as it drops, just tap follow in your podcast app. Math Science History is brought to you by caffeine. Delicious, delightful, life-supporting caffeine. If you'd like to support the show, you can find the coffee cup link in our show notes or at mathsciencehistory.com. Just click on that coffee cup. Your donations don't really go to coffee, but they really do help cover production costs. The MSH theme is public domain from the late, great music composer and professor, Dr. Lloyd Rogers. All other music is public domain from Pixabay. Until next time, carpe diem.